And today we are thrilled to speak with Cameron Halliday. He is the CEO of Mantel, a carbon capture company here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with a mission to decarbonize heavy industry. Cameron has a PhD in chemical engineering and an MBA from MIT. He's also a Breakthrough Energy Innovation Fellow and has been recognized in the 30 under 30 list of Forbes in the energy category. He co-founded Mantel, is the CEO now, and I'm going to give Cameron the chance to actually explain what exactly it is they're doing in the carbon capture space. But basically, a Mantel solution uses molten salts to capture CO2 and at a fraction of the cost of traditional methods. That sounds really, really exciting. Mantel already raised successfully a 30 million Series A financing round. Cameron, welcome to Climate Quest. We're really excited to have you here and learn about tough tech, climate tech, and your journey.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you briefly introduce yourself and tell us about what inspired you to found Mantel, and also tell us what Mantel does so that everybody can understand?
Of course. So we are a carbon capture company. So carbon capture is a very pragmatic approach to addressing our decarbonization goals. It is sort of an acceptance that a lot of the world emits a lot of CO2, and our entire kind of economy is based on this. And we have two options. We can rip it apart and try and rebuild it, or we can try and fix what we've got. And carbon capture is the latter. And in our perspective, both get us to the same point. It really comes down to what is the most cost-effective and socially acceptable way of doing this. And so what we do at Mantel is we're developing a new carbon capture technology that addresses that cost piece. And we would argue that the cost of this technology is really what has prevented its wide-scale deployment. And if we could do this at a low cost, it would be essentially a no-brainer for a lot of industry and solve, I would argue, the biggest challenge of this century, which is our climate crisis. So that's really, in essence, what we're about. We are spun out of MIT about 3 years ago. This started as my PhD work. So I was very fortunate to be sort of the innovator on this. This was truly think like scientific discovery in a dark lab in the middle of the night kind of vibes. And we stumbled across this new chemistry that made it very efficient to capture CO2 in these aggressive environments, the kinds of environments you find in heavy industry. So mentioned cement, steel, chemicals, also just like natural gas-fired power stations, refineries, like lots of basically everywhere where most of CO2 emissions are coming from. Those are the industries we go after. And our technology makes it efficient, and doing this efficiently is really the only way to do it cost effectively. And as I said, doing this cost effectively is the way to scale and deploy this to solve the problem we're all trying to solve.
Thank you, Cameron. And like you said, I'm just trying to understand the key here is the new material and the methodology that you developed.
Yeah, exactly. So the carbon capture as a technology space has been around for going on 100 years. And the way this has been done has been pretty similar for 100 years. It's a class of chemistry called amines. That's the chemical that captures the CO2. And for 100 years, people have been doing this in fairly niche applications. It's only in the past 20 or 30 years, people have really started thinking about using it as a way of reducing our CO2 emissions at the sort of climate level. And when people started doing that, they started to appreciate how expensive it would be. And so since then, a lot of folks have been innovating to find more cost-effective ways of doing this. And we stumbled across one that's very interesting. And that is our molten salt technology, which, as I said, does this at really high temperatures, which somewhat counterintuitively makes this very efficient. And doing this efficiently drives the cost down.
Can I jump in just a clarifying question in terms of cost? Can you give us a sense of what it looks like versus like a standard CDR?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question. So a lot of this comes back to even when we compare how are we going to decarbonize the world? Like you can actually convert all of these different approaches to $1 per ton of CO2 number. And our argument would be the lowest cost pathway is really going to dominate a lot of CO2 reduction technologies, pathways, whatever pathway it is, you can convert it to some $1 per ton number. If it's electrification, you can convert it to dollars per ton. If it's green hydrogen, you can do the same. And the same with carbon capture. And on the sort of what I'll call the revenue side, but you could also call it the like value side, is what is the willingness of society to pay for this? In an ideal world, there's a global carbon price, and that's like the most efficient way of doing this. And you can pick a number, and you would sort of reduce emissions if you could do it at a price less than that, or you would continue emitting if you couldn't. And I would say $100 a ton is a nice round number that people think about. There's other ways to calculate that kind of social cost of carbon, but let's call it $100 a ton. I would argue that most existing carbon capture technologies really struggle to hit $100 a ton. And that really explains why they haven't been widely deployed. Because the value that society is seeing, rightly or wrongly, is not sufficient to justify the cost. But if someone could come in and do this for $50 a ton, then you would see wide scale deployment, because it would be more cost effective than the emissions. And really that means like the damage that the climate crisis is doing. It's hard to quantify these things, but economists try to, and that's a way of doing it. And so we look at this, and we typically come in about half the cost of an amine system. So if they're $100 a ton, we're coming in around 50. There are scales and applications where we come down a lot further, and I would say $30, $40 a ton is not unreasonable for us, even in the near term at a large scale. But it does depend a lot on industry, geography, time frame, first of a kind, nth of a kind, those kind of questions. We believe firmly that we can do this at a significantly lower cost than the social cost, and that's what makes us excited about the potential to deploy this around.
Yeah, that's very impressive. Thank you.
And so your technology of capturing the CO2, are we in the realm of CCUS here, or is this also something that can be plugged into a direct air capture plant?
So carbon capture began as what I'll call point source carbon capture, which was capturing CO2 from the stack of heavy industrial companies, often very large industrial sites like power stations. There has been a recent enthusiasm around capturing it from the air as a way to avoid emissions that cannot be avoided in any other way. But it has other challenges. It's almost a different market. It's a slightly different market, but it is very similar technology. And so there's often a little bit of overlap and sometimes confusion about what the two things are. The way I describe it is point source carbon capture is about abatement. It's about preventing emissions, whereas carbon removal is about removing CO2 that's already been emitted from the atmosphere. They tend to have slightly different price points, but they're by and large achieving the same goal, which is to reduce the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. We focus on point source, so we're focused on abatement, although our technology does have applications for bioenergy and a concept called BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture, which is a pathway to carbon removal that we believe that can be very scalable, especially when applied to existing sources of biomass. So our first project is actually with a pulp and paper mill, and they produce a lot of CO2 emissions that's biogenic and is a really clear pathway towards near-term, low-cost CDR.
Thank you. So we are already understanding that this is pretty technical and pretty complex. Maybe we can talk a bit about what kind of challenges you had when you were first starting out, because I'm sure there were many, because people need to understand what you're doing and profitability, etc.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting journey that I've been on. It starts with a very grand vision and I think a lot of these deep technical companies, they're trying to solve a very, very big problem. And they tend to be doing it like 8 levels deep in some very nitty gritty in the weeds piece that it's believed that if you solve that little bit, the dominoes fall and you unlock the potential of solving the big scale problem. And a big challenge for companies like ours, especially in the early days, was communicating that. It can be very hard to explain the value of a very detailed technical innovation and how that like transfers all the way up to, okay, I'm going to change the world with the benefit to society. But that's kind of what we did. We were very much in the weeds. And I think a lot of the founder journey is learning to communicate that effectively. And it's hard. It takes time.
Comparing your startup to another tough tech startup not in the climate space, what are the differences, do you think?
Yeah, so the climate space, I said this at the beginning, I see this as probably one of the biggest challenges of this century. When you look at this energy transition, like the world has been through a few and they tend to change the world. And it's exciting to be operating in that space, but it's hard. It's really hard because you're fighting a lot of entrenched interests. I think in the climate space, you're particularly exposed to policy shifts, and we're seeing that now. And that's another level of challenge. Being in the hardware space versus software, there's a whole level of that. You're sort of, when you're doing hard climate tech, you're playing the game in hard mode on all levels, on all features. But that level of challenge is also what makes it exciting and interesting. If it was easy, I won't say if it's easy, anyone would do it. It's more like if it was easy, it wouldn't be as interesting to solve and figure it out. The fact that it's hard gives you opportunity to be creative and innovative. And that's kind of a very exciting place to be. So that's our perspective.
Cameron, I want to step back even a little before because we didn't get to hear how you ventured into this. Obviously, we heard about you doing the PhD. Were you starting the PhD with the mindset of, I want to end up somewhere in the climate space? Talk us through the journey a little bit and why you ended up where you ended up.
Yeah. It's I will start by saying everyone has a different journey, and you may start with a very clear goal. You may start and just find yourself where you are. And I was a little bit of the latter. So I had a very clear, I wanted to work on this problem even from undergrad. So I was an undergrad in the UK, and I came to the States at the very first as a visiting student. So doing work as an undergrad, I reached out to Professor Alan Hatton and said, hey, can I work in your lab on carbon capture? So even back then, I was very clear about what I wanted to work on. I had no idea that it would be a company, or I didn't have any thoughts on whether I wanted to be an academic or an industry. I just this is the problem I want to focus on. I find this exciting. And so I came and I ended up working on something else. But after 6 months, Professor Hatton sat me down and said, hey, I think you should come back and do a PhD. And I said, I have two conditions. One is I want to work on carbon capture. And the second was I wanted to do this dual MBA PhD program, because after that experience, I really got the sense that I would apply my skill set best, and I would enjoy the work most in industry, in deploying these technologies in the real world, as opposed to a more academic route. I was very let's be pragmatic and scale this. And so I came back and did the dual PhD MBA program at MIT. I worked on a handful of carbon capture technologies, some of which became companies, some of which were DAC companies, some of which were point source companies. But very early on, I would say about 6 months in, we discovered this chemistry that solved this efficiency problem. And I sort of took ownership of that project, and that became my thesis work. And I sort of became my life initially it was for 4 years, and then sort of continued on. That was my journey. Even during the PhD, there was no vision for a company. It was very much, I see this as a pragmatic solution. I appreciate and am excited about its potential. I had no idea the pathway to getting that deployed. I think at the time, I was fairly convinced that you work in academia on an idea, you develop it as far as you can go in academia, and then some big company will come in and scale it. And I learned I would actually say through the MBA experience, I learned that just doesn't work. I've seen that MIT has a really good ecosystem around this. So I got to see that even in biotech companies. The startup is a vehicle for transferring this innovation into the real world. You really need the passionate innovators behind these technologies driving this stuff forwards. Otherwise, it tends to die. And so I learned that. I wouldn't say the hard way, but I definitely learned that, and then realized that a startup would be a great vehicle for doing this. I met my co-founders, Danielle and Sean, at a class called Climate and Energy Ventures, where you sort of an incubator class where you get to meet other people who are interested in starting companies. We worked on that for a semester. We sort of sat down and said, hey, let's give it another semester. And then we were fortunate enough to raise our seed round and spin out. That was about 3 years ago.
That's amazing. And one thing we hear frequently is that lab to market chasms that you just mentioned. What for you was the aha moment? Was it the class that you felt like, okay, we could really build this into the company?
Yeah, it's a good question. There were a handful of aha moments. There was a deeply technical one that happened that sort of 6 months into the PhD near the beginning. That was the aha moment. We have a world-changing technology, but it is kind of scary to sit in that seat and see. And now, at the time, how do I say this? The naivety of it, I was like, oh, this won't be that hard. And now looking back, it's like, yeah, it's really hard to go from that point to where we are. And I would say we're still on our journey. We still have a ways to go. And that speaks to, as much it speaks to the scale of the opportunity as it does it's just the nature of this. The climate piece, the hard tech, tough tech piece, it's a long road to walk. It's exciting. There was a second aha moment which happened in the class, which I would say is me realizing, I think one of the things to the PhDs in the audience, one of the things that's hard as a PhD is you get very, very in the weeds and you can sort of lose sight of the bigger picture. There was a moment during that whole bunch of other people who didn't have necessarily the technical background that I do, very excited about the bigger vision, and it re-enthused me about the opportunity, and that was there's a real like chance that I can bring in the best minds and the most enthusiasm around this, and go and build a company and see this be successful. So that was a great moment. There's a handful.
Yeah.
And Cameron, I can just confirm that I took the Climate and Energy Ventures class last semester, and Mantel is always on the slides, and they're still really proud that you're alums.
That class has been very successful at spinning out companies.
Yes.
It's actually quite insane how many companies have spun out of this little class that is, I would describe it does do a lot of sort of edification, but really its value proposition is it just brings a bunch of people into a room to discuss an idea, and then it just takes fruit from there. It's a really great way to start these things.
Yeah, great testament to the class and the success. Back to Mantle. Can you tell us a little bit how you balance profitability and climate impact in your business model? We touched on the price point and social cost a little bit, but how do you think through the broader picture and business model?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things, and there's a little bit of a pragmatist in me that'll come through here, is we believe quite firmly that if this is not profitable, it's not sustainable. So if these technologies can't see a real market, then they're not really going to be deployed in the way that is necessary to really have an impact. That can allude to like failures in policy, that can allude to a lot of things. But what it's helped us do is we get very, very strategic about what opportunities we pursue. If we're speaking with a customer, say we're speaking with a customer in a jurisdiction that doesn't have a firm incentive to decarbonize, but they're talking a big game, we actually devalue that. We know that they need to be able to financially justify this investment to really deploy our technology. And so we focus very much on customers where we can see the financial motives that are driving them to use us and decarbonize. In the US, 45Q is a tax credit that motivates this. In Canada, there's a carbon tax and an investment tax credit. In Europe, there's an emissions trading scheme. So these policies and schemes exist, but it is, I would say those two things, profitability and sustainability, do need to go hand in hand. If you just have profitability, then I argue you're not really in the climate space. If you just have sustainability, then I argue you're going to have a really hard time scaling and actually having the impact that you want to have. You need to find a way to get both of them. And that's technical, that's market, that's commercial, like all those things need to come together, but you do need both.
Yeah, definitely. If you were to start on your journey all over again, what would you do differently?
Don't make me do that. I think I alluded to this earlier. There's a little bit of me that thinks you kind of need to not understand how hard it's going to be to take the first step. Because if you knew how hard it would be, I probably wouldn't take the step again. But it is really rewarding. There is nothing quite like being an entrepreneur where there's no glass ceiling. There's no one to blame other than yourself. And there's something very freeing about that. Your success is completely in your control, and that's a really exciting place to work. If I were to start over again, there are little things that I've definitely learned along the way. If I did this again, I think I'd be able to do it in half the time, but I don't think realistically I wouldn't have known them. And no matter how many great people I could have spoken to about their experience, everyone's journey is so different that you just have to kind of live it.
Yeah. Yeah, no wonder everyone loves investing in multiple time founders because they know you learn all the mistakes on your own skin.
Exactly. And they're not big things. They're little things that could have made our lives a lot easier.
Absolutely. What advice would you give to other young entrepreneurs listening to this now and looking up to everything you have solved already? Where would you advise they start?
My high level advice is keep going. This is a really hard journey, but it is very rewarding, and it can be really tough. There are a lot of days where it's brutal, but it is when you get through those days, there are days that really make this such an amazing experience. So my only advice is keep going. I guess my other advice, a little bit sort of counter to that, is a lot of people have a lot of advice, And it can be very overwhelming when you're inexperienced to have all these people giving you advice. And almost inevitably, a lot of it conflicts. And it can be really hard to navigate all of that advice. So when people ask me for advice, I often try and not give too much, because it's really your journey to walk, and you're the best person to question the advice and make the decisions. You should hear as many perspectives as you can, but take it all with a grain of salt and make your decision based on the information you have and what you believe to be best. That's my advice.
Well, speaking of advice, are there any resources, tools, or networks that help you and you would recommend to others? We heard about the MIT class. Not everybody has this amazing opportunity to go to that. Anything else that you found helpful?
I think the biggest resource is other founders, other people who have lived through this. I would specifically narrow it to folks that are a year, 2 to 3 years ahead of you in your journey. Wherever you're at in your journey, find people who are far enough ahead that they can look back and provide some interesting insights that you can leverage to bear on your own experience, but are not so far ahead that they've forgotten how hard it was. So anyone who's 2 to 3 years beyond where you think you are today, just talk to them about their experience, talk to them what they would have done differently, what their biggest headaches have been. One of the hardest parts about this journey is those challenges come from every direction. Every single direction, there's something, and it's basically impossible to predict all of it. So you've just got it's an attitude that you need to take to just be able to take whatever comes on the chin.
Thank you, Cameron. That's great advice. And before we close, we wanted to have a little look out into the next future, the next future years. So the general sentiment right now is a bit low in the climate tech space. Everybody's very uncertain about the next years, and the mood and all the conferences has been a bit low in the last week. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what you think about that and what's next for you and Mantel, and what you're excited about, because I hope you're excited about something in the next years here in the climate tech space.
Yeah, so I alluded to political swings as a risk for climate, and that everyone should know that going in. What gives me a lot of enthusiasm is a few things. One, I'll say at the beginning, everyone, not just the companies, but even our customers they're looking much longer than 4 years, and there's planning. These companies are looking in the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s about how they remain successful. In some cases, how they remain relevant, and looking for solutions that last beyond these swings. And so I will say there's no concern and question about where the tide is going. And I would argue we all knew this wouldn't be a smooth ride from whenever we feel like we started this journey in 2000, 2010 or whatever, to where we need to go in 2050, 2070. It's not going to be that clean. And so what gives me a lot of enthusiasm is I feel like, especially in my space, in point source carbon capture, we ride that very well. We are in many ways down the middle of the road here. We are often supporting heavy industrial companies that are emitting a lot of fossil fuels in their decarbonization journey. And so there's excitement for point source capture from those companies because they get to continue being relevant. But there's excitement on the other side because they get to decarbonize and actually save the planet. So there's a narrative and story that we tell for both sides, which makes us a lot more stable. These companies, us and other climate tech companies, need to be robust enough to survive these kinds of swings. In climate, it's policy related. If you look back in history, it could be market related, it could be economics related, it could also be policy related. But there are always going to be swings in your macro environment. And you need to build companies that are robust to that. And that's what we're building at Mantel. So that gives me a lot of enthusiasm. I will also add another positive note. I do feel like you're seeing the shifts in the US do sort of ripple through the world. And you actually see other jurisdictions and ecosystems stepping up. I do feel like you're seeing the EU step up in a very big way. You're seeing Canada start to step up. You're seeing a lot of reactions that in some ways can benefit the ecosystem. But no one said this would be smooth.
What a great way to end this episode. So everybody stay resilient, focus on the long term, and it's not going to be smooth, but worth it. So thank you, Cameron, so much for being here and answering our questions. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Cameron.
Thank you.